here if it wasn't for your actions. Is it safe to say that you wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Esther's actions?
100%. She was, along with HaKodesh Baruch Hu, she was the principal actor in securing my release. She worked with a lot of people, but she was the driving force behind the entire effort to bring me home. And if it hadn't been for her, first of all, I don't think I would have made it in prison, but second of all, I probably wouldn't have made it home either. So to answer your question, yeah, she was the principal actor in the effort to bring me home.
And she did a lot of intense things that risked her life and her safety to try to get home. And she also met with very important politicians. Was a lot of that her idea on her own, or you suggested? How did she guys?
Well, she and I had a very good relationship, despite the problems of communicating in the prison, from the prison. But she never did anything without discussing it with me first. And she had a tremendous team here in Israel, led principally by Adi Ginsburg out of Tel Aviv. And there were others like Rabbi Pesach Lerner, the former executive director of National Council of Young Israel, who were really the principal people, along with others like Farley Weiss and others who helped significantly along the way. But she was the focal point. She was the one that kind of initiated a lot of things, and she pursued a policy of consensus. So she never did anything that our team was really opposed to at all. So she was trying to manage a case that was very complicated, because the issues that galvanized people here in Israel were not the ones that galvanized people in the United States, the Jewish community in the United States in particular. Here, the issue was, as she pointed out, you don't leave a soldier in the field. In Chutz La'aretz, in the United States, the issue was one of equal justice. So it was difficult for her to balance these two, at times, dissimilar agendas. But she did a commendable job in squaring the circle. I'll put it that way.
There's this great story you told at her shiva a year ago where basically you were in prison 10 years and you got an upgrade, but she told you that it might not work so well if you get this upgrade. Could you tell the audience about it?
Yeah. In the dorm that I lived in, there were several hundred people, but there were only 4 rooms with bathrooms. And the bathrooms that were for the rest of us were pretty bad. Sniwut didn't exist for that. It's a little embarrassing, right? So finally, after 10 years, I was awarded for good conduct one of the rooms with the bathroom. And I was very excited about it, naturally.
You waited 10 years for that.
I waited 10 years for a clean toilet, yeah. Yes. So I called her, and I was very excited, and she wasn't. And I just said, oh, no. And I said, what's the problem? And she said, you can't take the room. And I said, why? And she said, how can you daven in a room with a toilet? You can't do that. So I said, how about for one night? And she said, no, you can't. So I went to the administrator of the unit, and I explained that I couldn't take the room, and he thought I might need psychiatric help for that. And I said, no, there's a reason why, there's a religious reason why. So there was another fellow who got the room, and it flooded that night. The toilet backed up. And he came to my room, knocked on the door, and said, you knew what was going to happen. And I said, well, I knew what was going to happen if I didn't do the right thing. So good luck and goodbye, and I shut the door. So
you've said many times, though, that Esther, that is your teacher.
My morah.
Yeah.
Yeah. She was my morah then, and now I have a new morah, Rivka. And her knowledge of halacha, Jewish history, customs, was almost encyclopedic. There was an issue for many years. I couldn't get access to the damages, the actual damage assessment, not what was presented in court, which was basically a put-up job by Caspar Weinberger, but the actual damage assessment. After 20 years of working hard to get access to it, we finally got it. And what it said in there was that the only damage to the United States that I had committed was that I had angered America's Arab allies, because in their opinion I had made Israel too strong. Alavai. So that was one of the main contentions in the damage assessment, that I had, according to the Arab states, made Israel too strong. The second reason was kind of a procedural thing, that the type of information that was provided Israel should have been part and parcel of a quid pro quo, where information would have been given to Israel and Israel would have responded. But the whole reason for the operation in the first part was that process had broken down, and that the United States, basically Caspar Weinberger and Admiral Bobby Ray Inman, who was the number 2 under Bill Casey at the CIA, had decided after the Israeli raid on Tuwaitha, on the Iraqi nuclear plant, to basically effect an undeclared intelligence embargo against Israel. And when I asked my Israeli colleagues, why don't you go public with this? Why don't you go to Capitol Hill, even behind closed doors? Their answer, which was compelling, was that if our enemies get a misperception of what's going on, it could precipitate a war, because they would feel that Israel was essentially being stabbed in the back, betrayed, undermined by the United States, and hence vulnerable. And as we know through history, more wars have been started by misperception than they have by calculation. So they were concerned about that, and I understood that. I was asked by one Jewish leader, why didn't I go to Capitol Hill and bring my concerns to them, or why didn't I go public with this? And my answer was, it would have leaked. And again, the same problem would have occurred of misperception. So I said to him, what would you have done if I had come to you with my concerns? And I had basically backed up my story with evidence. And he looked at me for a second and he said, I would have offered you coffee or tea and then called the FBI and had you arrested for being a agent provocateur. I said, but the truth didn't enter into the picture here? Wouldn't have entered? And he said, no. So I was blocked at all avenues, acceptable avenues, legal avenues, to correct this situation. And really, I had only 3 options that I faced. One, I could do nothing. And after the Khurban, that wasn't an option.
And you had family members that died in the show?
A lot. And I had one that was on a voyage of the damned that, thank God, jumped ship off Trinidad and was sponsored by Lyndon Johnson into the United States. And he later more or less directed the 8th Air Force's bombing campaign of Cologne, where he came from. And I said, wow, you actually saved the cathedral, because it was the only thing left standing in central Cologne. He said, no, I tried really hard to hit that place, but for some reason it just didn't work out. So yeah, we lost everybody except for 3 relatives that got out of Germany.
And I told you, if you see something, do something.
No, I grew up with that, that it was drilled into me, personal responsibility. That one of the major mistakes the American Jewish community made during the Second World War was that they were more loyal to Roosevelt than they were to their own people, our people. So it was drilled.
A lot of things haven't changed.
Most things haven't changed. So as a result, my father, Alev Shalom, warned me not to go into the intelligence field. because he said, you will be faced with that issue. Who do you come? Who are you going to defend? Your people or your boss? So, okay, so the first option wasn't an option. The second option was to basically not do anything myself, but to go forward and try to work within the system. But I realized that it was the system itself that had instituted this undeclared intelligence embargo against Israel, so I would have been putting my head on a chopping block. I remember one of the first experiences I had with exactly what the intelligence community felt towards Israel was when I and several other new hires were asked to do some evaluations of old incidents that happened, and I unfortunately drew the liberty. So I looked at everything that was in the files, and I basically wrote a report that had exonerated Israel for what happened. It was a mistake. And the officer that was conducting this exam looked at me really hard and said, whose side are you on?
Wow.
So I said to him the truth. As an intelligence officer, we owe our absolute, unqualified loyalty to the truth. And he said, I've got my eye on you. Okay, that's fine. So that there was no way of me working within the system. And I went all the way up to the Secretary of Defense's office to see if we could do something about this problem with the undeclared intelligence embargo, and there was just doors slammed in my face, and it wasn't going to go anywhere. So the third option was to do something myself, and it was not an option that I readily accepted because there was a very high degree of risk involved with this. And one of the things I tried to do to mitigate the risk was to make sure that all the information that I eventually passed to Israel was supposed to have been passed to Israel. And when I was indicted, a lot of people don't realize this, but my actual indictment says very clearly that I committed a crime without intent to harm the United States. That's a crucial distinction. Why? Because we all understand that there's some information which is so sensitive and so potentially dangerous. If shared with anybody, even our closest allies, and I say I get confused with pronouns sometimes, with the closest allies of the United States, would do incalculable damage to the national security. And in that case, if I had violated that understanding, I should have and would have been charged with intent to harm the United States. Even though that wasn't my intent, the damage I would have caused by sharing information that never should have been shared, ever, would have justified that kind of indictment. So I wasn't charged with intent to harm, again, which is a crucial distinction that most people simply either don't know about or don't care to factor into my actions. The other thing has to do with the alleged money involved in the operation, in my operation. Most of my operational time with Israel was done for free. I never received a penny. But there came a point in time where I was asked to consider fully crossing the line and becoming a full-scale Israeli intelligence officer, field officer. And I had already basically crossed that line. So I said yes. And so at that point I received, just as CIA field agents do, who work in other jobs, front jobs, a salary. It was taxed. I paid bituach leumi. I paid everything. And so when I was eventually caught, in the absence of any hard information showing damage to the United States, what prosecutors do in that case is they go after the character of the agent. And in my case, by darkening my character and my motives, they hope to kind of sully Israel's reputation in the United States. Well, the sentencing judge, who was definitely no friend of mine, refused to fine me. Because as he said in court, I have two choices. I can either fine Mr. Pollard as a mercenary, or I can give him a life sentence as an ideologue. So luckily he gave me a life sentence as an ideologue, and I thanked him. Everybody considered that sarcastic on my part, but I actually was very appreciative that he did that. But again, this is another point that a lot of people just don't either know about or don't care about. I think I'm the only spy that was never fined by the government for his actions. So there was that third option of actually doing something myself. And the more I got into it, the more I realized the nature, the full scope of the betrayal. And it was very, very, very frightening. There was one particularly egregious moment when I was arguing why a certain piece of technology wasn't shared with Israel, according to the exchange agreement. And their attitude was, well, let them lose a couple airplanes and they'll figure out, how to counter this technology. And I'm thinking to myself, that could be my cousin flying that airplane. And so it just kind of confirmed in my own mind that I had to go forward with what I was doing. There was no prevarication on my part as far as holding back things or stopping from acting. I had to go forward. And so this was perhaps the most dangerous intelligence operation Israel undertook. Why? Because of it could have potentially jeopardized the relationship between Israel and the United States. So the individuals that authorized my operation, and it was not just Rafi Eitan, but the cabinet members that authorized this information were very level-headed people. They knew who I was. They knew where I was working. They knew what the risks were. And yet, when you work out cost-benefit analysis, the potential cost of me being caught and exposed basically paled in comparison to the benefit. And I really can't, the only thing I can point to is that, an example, there was a facility in Iraq that was producing poison gas. And it was Saddam Hussein fully intended to use the gas against Israel at one point. And so Israel asked officially for confirmation. They had heard that this plant existed. We didn't have a satellite at the time. So they had to use spies, human intelligence, or exchange of information with allies like the United States. So they asked officially for confirmation of whether this plant existed. And they were told, no, it didn't. No. So to double check, they tasked me. So at one meeting, I had laid out on the floor, it was about 10 feet by 10 feet, a mosaic of the plant. And it was the largest poison gas plant outside the Soviet Union at the time. And my team members, just looked at this picture that, according to the Americans, didn't exist. And one of them said to me, it's better sometimes to deal with reliable enemies than unreliable allies. And that, I will never forget that, because there was the proof right there. So the threat from Iraq at the time was profound. as far as Israel was concerned. And one of the consequences of my actions was the decision by the Israeli government, Chaga, the Home Front Command, to shift to sealed rooms. Previously, we had all been concerned with bombardment, conventional bombardment, so you needed kind of a bomb shelter for that. Well, in gas warfare, chemical warfare, a bomb shelter could be a death trap, because there's no filtration of air or anything like that. It's just a bomb shelter, that's all. So as a result of that information coming through in terms of the exact threat posed by Iraqi chemical warfare to Israel's civilian population, we went to sealed rooms. If you remember, if any of you were here during the initial Gulf War. So that's an example of how important the operation was.
And you speak about betrayal. Even though you helped the Jewish state survive, you take a look at some of your biggest enemies: Caspar Weinberger, William Cohen, Judge Ginsburg, Ralph Eitan. I'd like to spend the floor there. How does that make you feel? You save Jews, and then your biggest enemies, some of them are fellow Jews.
It wasn't a surprise. I mean, I grew up on what happened during the Khurban, where some of our biggest enemies were our own people.
The Kapos.
Right, the Kapos. And I don't mean the ones in the camps. That's a different story. I'm not going to judge anybody who was in that situation. But the Kapos in the United States, who basically knew what Roosevelt was doing, knew about the Khurban and did it less than nothing. So was I surprised? No, but this has been a feature of our people really ever since the night of darkness in Egypt. I mean, how many did we lose?
80%, right?
Yeah, it was crazy how many people we lost. And even after that, the percentage of Erev Rav that came across, we're still dealing with. Even here in Israel right now, people who are masquerading as friends of the Jewish people or Zionists or people concerned with the nature of our democracy and things like that. These are people that you have to understand have a double agenda with regard to Jews and Israel. With the United States, the biggest problem is, well, the example that I use is there are two ways of killing a Jew. You can either kill us with a Khurban, whether it's a crusade, a pogrom, Shmelnitsky, any of them, the Tat V'Tat, whatever. Or you can kill them by love, assimilation, acceptance. It's in the United States, it's what I call an auto-genocide. And the people that betrayed me and the Jewish community were basically the same types of people that betrayed our European brothers and sisters during the Khurban. They cared more about their standing in the Golden Medina than they did about the welfare of our people writ large. And if you look at the situation right now in the United States, these are the same people, our so-called leaders, that are responsible for the cultural genocide that's going on with the Jewish community in the United States. I mean, the handwriting is on the wall as far as the safety, both culturally and physically, of the American Jewish community. And those people don't want to admit that. These are our so-called leaders, Jewish leaders, self-elected, self-appointed, self-sustaining so-called Jewish leaders who are responsible for this mess that we find the Jewish community in the United States. They're the same ones that basically threw me to the dogs. There was one bit of Freedom of Information Act material that I was lucky enough to get that concerned a then newly appointed executive director of a very large umbrella Jewish organization based in New York. And I was amazed that it wasn't redacted in any form. It was a transcript of a meeting between him, the then president of the American Conference of Major Jewish Organizations, and Secretary of State George Shultz. It was right after I was sentenced, and Shultz asked this man, the executive director, if there was any problem with my life sentence. Was there any problem in the Jewish community? And the answer was, yes, there's a problem. I deserve the death penalty.
I've had Jews tell me that.
Yeah, I deserve the death penalty because I called into question their standing. And my response to people like that, and I had an opportunity to publicly talk to him about this, much to his discomfort, but I had a problem with that. And the problem is, if you're so unsure of your station in this golden Medina, then don't go after me. Go after the people that are causing this trouble. I described my case not so much as a question of dual loyalty, but of dual standard of justice. That's all. And they didn't want to deal with that because it kind of upset their myth that the United States represented something, the experience in the United States, the government in the United States, the culture in the United States represented something fundamentally different from everything else our people had experienced for 2,000 years of exile. And unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Galut is galut. Galut is a curse for a reason, because everything that you think is so nice about galut ultimately kills you, either spiritually or physically. You take your pick.
Yes.
So,
Rav Kanan pointed out this my program earlier that galut is a punishment. You're not supposed to want to continue. You're supposed to want to get out. I bring up this point because there's approximately 6 million Jews in North America. 10% would be 600,000. 1% is 60,000. 10% and 1% would be 6,000. And only about 3,000 Jews from America make Aliyah.
right.
And I think a lot of that, I hate to say this, but you have Orthodox rabbis that are making a really good living. And if they tell their congregants to make Aliyah, it would hurt their business.
Okay, I agree. Look, I had arguments on both sides of the religious spectrum with ultra-liberal rabbis, quote unquote, and ultra-Orthodox rabbis. And their positions were very interesting. The hard left felt that the United States was the golden Medina. That was our homeland. They were, I wouldn't even say they were culturally Jewish. They just basically pretended to be Jewish, but they weren't. They were basically woke politicians that were self-elected leaders of the Jewish community. And their concern was basically making sure that things were good for them, these particular rabbis. The ultra-Orthodox rabbis that I had problems with in New York were those that were saying, we're waiting for Moshiach. Okay, and when Moshiach comes, then we'll go home. And it was Esther, alayha shalom, that confronted a bunch of them and said, oh, you're waiting for Moshiach? Yeah? Well, maybe Moshiach is waiting for you. And what is he waiting for? He's waiting for you to go home. And they had no answer to that. They had absolutely no answer. And the problem with American Jews is it was too nice for them there in the United States. But now the house is burning. And they just can't get themselves to break this. It's a fancy term is idée fixe, this preconceived notion that the United States is somehow different than our experience. It represents a different situation than our people have faced down through the ages. And it just isn't that way. And we're seeing it now. And when you ask people, are you ready to come? Finally, are you ready to come? And they said, I've heard every excuse. Our kids are in school. Our grandparents are here. We have a mortgage to pay. I've heard every single excuse. The kosher supermarket, has 120 different dips. Okay, that's fine. I guess they haven't been in Geula lately. So when you make up absurd excuses like this, it's clear. if the person is an otherwise smart person, that they're living in a land of self-deception. And unfortunately, as my family found out in Germany, you can wait until it's too late.
So not just is there an issue of violence. I mean, there was 2 people shot last week in L.A., and 3 days ago, a gentleman about a week before his wedding was murdered in Miami. The news didn't even care about it. There's that aspect, obviously, which is terrible. But there's also stuff like with Brandeis University. You told a story a few months ago at the Yehuda Cohen's event.
Yeah.
Tell us about that. I was shocked this.
Yeah, a friend of ours had a granddaughter that had been accepted to Brandeis. I talked to her and congratulated her. And I said, what are you majoring in? And she said, pre-med, kol hakavod, wonderful. And but there was something wrong in how she was talking to me about her impending attendance at Brandeis. And I said, what's the problem? And she said, well, I'm from, I wear a Mogen David, I wear conservative clothes. I'm active in any number of pro-Israel organizations, and they want me to stay, the university wants me to stay in a particular dorm with the rest of the people who are like me because my beliefs are a provocation.
Wow.
And this is at Brandeis. Okay? So even in a place like Berkeley, where there's a small Jewish organization there, student organization, that's fighting valiantly to defend our right to live as Jews in that academic environment. One of the biggest problems they have there is with the local rabbi who's at Hillel. And this is not restricted to Berkeley. This Hillel has a problem. They're woke. And as a result, they're part of the problem. But nobody wants to talk about it, or much less do anything about it, to such an extent that I talked to the previous diaspora minister, Nachman Shai, and I said to him, we shouldn't be talking about Aliyah right now in normal terms or historical terms. I said what we should see Aliyah as is a rescue operation right now. And especially for American Jewish college-age kids. It's impossible for them right now on any American campus to actually live as a openly as a Jew, much less as a pro-Israel Jew. So I said what we should be doing is opening up our universities to a special program to take these kids in, accept their credit, first in science courses, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, where the language of instruction is English, and to let them graduate here in a Jewish environment and hopefully stay. And, well, he listened politely, and that was about the end of that story. So I'm hoping that with the current government that we'll be able, especially with Amichai Shikli, we'll be able to do something about that program. We'll try to get it enacted. Shikli is a good man, and I think he understands the nature of the threat posed to our kids in college overseas. So hopefully we'll be able to do something about that.
So again, this is another episode of the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports and News Radio, and our guest is Mr. Jonathan Pollard. Obviously, I agree with you, but I want to ask the devil's advocate question, if you don't mind. If the Jewish people watching this in America, and they're thinking about making Aliyah, and we say to them, okay, violence in L.A., Miami, New York, etc., they could say back, violence in Jerusalem, violence all over.
Okay, I had that problem with a relative of mine that I confronted on why he wasn't actually coming to Israel, because he'd talked about it for years. And he said, it's too violent. It's the Middle East. It's, shuafat, it's horrible. So I said, okay, I'm going to call you back in a week, okay? And we're going to start this conversation up again. And for that week, I did a media search of all the school shootings and mass shootings in supermarkets and mayhem in Chicago. I mean, there were hundreds of people over that period of time that were just flat out murdered. in the United States. So when I talked to him again, I said, look at your email. And he did. And he said, yeah, and? I said, well, who should be scared? I said, violence here, it's the same everywhere. Yeah, it's terrible. But we're in our own land here, and we will eventually get a hold of this problem and correct it. But I said, you are living in total anarchy. You can't defend yourself. Nobody's interested in defending you. And the powers that be in Washington right now, the Biden administration, are part of the problem. So I said, who's in danger? I said, you could come here and live a very safe life. And then, of course, I have a problem keeping my mouth shut. I said, and if you do die, you'll die al Kiddush Hashem. So, what's the problem? You'll go straight to Gan Eden. There's not a problem. He didn't really accept that explanation very well. So,
yes, I have some cousins in the States, and I'm going to try not to use that explanation. But I tried different ways with House Barah, but not that so much. Okay, fair enough at that point. Obviously, I've been in Israel 15 years. I've never felt safer any place in the world. Mm-hmm. Very happy about that. But I take a look in America, I want to keep an eye on it, and this gun thing scares me. They take away people's guns because that's what they did with us in Europe, right?
Well, especially in Germany. A lot of people don't realize. I had an uncle, basically had been in the First World War, got an Iron Cross. He was a front soldier. He was a combat soldier. And the first thing the Nazis did was tell everybody to hand in your guns. And like good citizens, they were stupid enough to do it. We have a Second Amendment in the United States, which has been argued back and forth. Now it's
under threat.
Yeah, it's under threat. But if you have to live in a country where you feel obligated or compelled to carry a gun, you have to really start questioning where you're living, why you're living there. In the United States right now, there's no deterrence at all to the kind of violence that we're experiencing. I was in New York on parole with Esther, Alei Shalom, when the Black Lives Matter and the Antifa tore the city to pieces. I was at a park one day. There was an elderly white couple sitting on a bench, and 3 BLM activists with baseball bats came up to them and told them that park bench was reserved for people of color. And I guess the man couldn't hear what they were saying, and they proceeded to beat both of them up with baseball bats. So I yelled at 2 policemen, they're going to kill these people, go help them. And one cop said, I'm a couple of weeks away from my retirement. I don't want to lose my job, and turned their backs on these 2 elderly people that were just getting the hell beaten out of them. So this was New York at the time. And Esther couldn't wear her jewelry on the street because they would come up and just rip the jewelry off women right in front of policemen who did nothing. I had lived in New York and worked in New York back in the early 80s, and it was pretty bad. I mean, I carried a gun, and I was scared back then. This was before Giuliani, when the city was literally falling apart. And what I found in New York this time, when I went back, was in some sense even worse than what it was years before when I was there in the early 80s. Why? Because the criminals, broadly defined, felt empowered. At least back in the early 80s, they knew they were criminals. Now, they're not criminals anymore.
They're like freedom fighters.
They're freedom fighters, exactly. Yes. They're freedom fighters. So when I talk to my cousins who are still in New York, I try to point this out. I ask them, do you ride the subway? Oh, hell no. Are you, we're not crazy. And I said, think about that. Think about that. So
that is something else. Again, this is the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports and News Radio. I heard a couple different prison stories regarding, I want to see what is true, what is not. It's my understanding that Rav Eliyahu came to visit you very, very often. And for those who don't know what he looks like, one could argue he kind of looks like an imam. Mm-hmm. And the story is that after he visited you, some people in the prison kind of gave you respect.
It wasn't some people. What happened was he came in his robes, his vestment, as the Rishon LeZion. And where I was the only Jew on the compound, about 5,000 men. And it was in the south. And there were an awful lot of black Muslims that were there. And the word got out that an imam had come to visit me, a famous imam, because he looked like one, right? So the actual imam of the prison, who was a Wahhabi, by the way, but a decent man nonetheless, from Gary, Indiana.
All right.
Yeah.
Shout out to Gary, Indiana.
Yeah. Called me in and said, was there a famous sheikh or imam that came to visit you today? And I said, no, it wasn't a famous sheikh, it was a famous rabbi that came to see me. So he said, don't correct the record. Just let everybody think that you're protected. So, okay. So a lot of the new Muslim guys that came into the prison came to see me to ask for advice on their faith and their religion and how often they should daven, as I put it. They didn't know the difference anyway, so we have all these Muslim guys davening all the time, which was kind of funny.
But not in cells with toilets.
Correct. And so for 23 years, this mistaken impression of the Rav relieved me of any problems with the Muslim population in the prison. I never had a second, a minute, an hour, a day, nothing. No problem from them at all.
And so, I know you discussed that it meant so much to you for it to come because you were in Gehenna. And here's a big Tzaddik coming to visit you. Can you correlate that? We know, obviously, in Tanakh, there's Yosef Tzaddik was in prison for 12 years. Did you get a chance to study those stories and try to relate? I know you were in prison 18 years longer than him, but still, you try to...
Well, there was a story that the Rav told me that kind of clarified things for me. He had a private meeting with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and the Rav asked Rav Schneerson, alav shalom, why was it that he wasn't doing more to help me, or doing anything to help me? And his answer came as a shock to Kavod Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, Zefer Tzadik Livracha, and to me when I found out about it. And the Rebbe said that I was completing Yosef HaTzaddik's sentence. So, I took a deep breath at that point. And
easy for him to say, right?
Yeah, well, okay, you look at who's saying it, so you have to give it credibility. All right. But that wasn't so much to make me feel proud of myself, but it's to add another layer of obligation and responsibility on me, because I had to be letter perfect in my midot in prison. I realized I couldn't do anything that was opposed to our faith at that point. In whatever way you want to define it, whether it means doing drugs, doing liquor, gambling, cheating on things, whatever. I mean, I really had to follow the line. And I only got one black mark in 30 years in prison.
Officially, not people, because you discussed before that violence sometimes happens in this place.
You don't count killing people in prison. That, I'm sorry, I mean, that just is the way it is. When I was sent to the first prison at Marion, a special unit in the prison that was 150 meters underground, the warden stopped me at the front gate and said, look at the ground. It's green grass. Look at the sky. It's blue. You smell the air. It's fresh. Yeah. He said, well, when you come out of this prison, you'll be in a body bag and you'll be an old man. So I don't know why I said this, but I looked at him and I said, that's not right. God runs the world, not you. So he leaned forward rather menacingly and said, we'll see about that. So 7 years later, I was the only one that walked out alive from the unit I was in. And of course, he's standing there. And I have a problem with time and place. And maybe I should have just, acknowledged his existence and moved on, but I couldn't help it. And I looked at him and I said, you see, God runs the world. So he punched me out and knocked a tooth out of my head and knocked me out. And I had never felt such joy at pain before because I realized he was so mad at me that, okay, he knocked a tooth out. So that was the only black mark, because he wrote down in my official record that I had incited a riot.
Wow. And,
there are about 20 guys with guns outside a prison, all pointed at me. There isn't an inmate within sight, but I tried to incite a riot. So when this was read out at my last parole hearing, everybody thought that was pretty funny. So it wasn't held, luckily it wasn't held against me. Hopefully it won't, So, no, it was a major problem for me in terms of forcing me to live a more appropriate life in prison. When I went into that first prison, and the door shut, and the cell was 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters, and the light never went off, and they flushed the toilet maybe, twice, 3 times a week. And they served us, I think it was dog food. I hope it was dog food. At least that would have been sterilized. I had to make a decision. What was I going to do? Because I was facing a life sentence. So I made the reacquaintance of Hashem at that point, because I realized that I didn't have the capacity or the wherewithal to do this experience on my own. So, like Avram Avinu, I negotiated with God. And I said, if I do this, and this, will you save my life? And he did. So I'm still honoring that promise that I made to him so many years ago. It was a real pivotal moment for me at that point. And when people ask me, well, didn't you consider suicide? And someone did suggest that. An official representative of the Israeli intelligence community came to me in prison and said, you're causing a lot of problems for...
thank you.
Yeah, well, Yuli Edelstein investigated it in his new book that came out by him. The story is laid out. And the individual responsible for sending someone to kill myself basically told a small court that had been convened, when asked, did you do this, said no comment. And that's not an option in a court. It's either yes or no, or I don't recollect, but it was no comment. So when this happened, there was an American officer, a lieutenant colonel, in fact, sitting next to me, threw the guy out. And he said, your dad went through Vietnam, your brother went through Vietnam, you were in roots of Vietnam, you don't die for politicians. And I said, you don't have to worry, Jews don't commit suicide. We buy retail. So he didn't get it. It was a wasted joke, so that's all right. So no, I never considered that for a moment.
But just to clarify, because the idea of someone from the Israeli intelligence doing that, I don't know one here watches movies, but there's this movie called Godfather 2.
Yeah, I saw it.
Where Tom Hagen is asked to see Frank Pentangeli and suggests that he commits suicide.
Yes.
This is
and he did.
And he did.
Yeah.
So this
in a bathtub.
That's right. And he somehow snuck a knife in there.
Yeah.
But this Israeli intelligence stuff, they sound like gangsters. This is crazy.
Some are. There are a lot of guys I'm aware of that didn't make it just because of that, of betrayal. There was one moment where I was asked to come again to testify about Iran-Contra. And A lawyer came to me and sat me down with my lawyer and said, here, I want you to see something. And there was a paper in Spanish from Monterey. I don't speak Spanish. So I said, I don't know what this is saying. He said, well, you can see the picture. And it was an airplane that had obviously exploded on the runway. It was a private airplane that had exploded. And I said, okay, what am I supposed to get out of this? And he said, well, that's your partner that was coming back to testify. So I said, okay. He said, how's your memory? So I said, non-existent.
I don't recall.
I don't recall. And he said, remember that when you walk the track every day, because the last thing you might see is a glint of light in a tree line. So, look, there was a whole other aspect to my case that a lot of people are not aware of, and it represented a real threat to me. Aldrich Ames,
Right.
the Soviet mole, was tasked by his KGB control officers to implicate me in all of the then ongoing deaths of American agents in Russia, in the Soviet Union, to try to protect him. I don't hold it against him. I mean, I would have done the same thing to protect myself if I could have. Years later, one of the prosecutors came to see me to apologize for what happened. And I refused to take his hand. And Esther said, be a gentleman and take his hand. He came to see you, take his hand. He asked me, where was your mind when the judge asked you whether you had any remorse for all the murders, killings, deaths that you had caused? And I said, Tunis. October 1985, I was one of the intelligence officers that put together the Israeli airstrike that was supposed to kill Arafat. There had been a terrible pigua in Cyprus. The three of our people were just brutally murdered, and the government decided that's it. Arafat's got to go. And okay, for one reason or another, he deviated from his routine. The jets passed over, blew up his headquarters in Tunis, and killed about 90 of his Force 17 security people. Okay. So the judge asked me, do you have any remorse for all of the people that you killed? And I said, yes. That there wasn't one more. Okay. So the prosecutor asked me, where was your mind at the time? I said, Tunis. October 1985. He said, well, that's not where the judge was. The judge had just been told by Aldrich Ames how General Trechikov, his AKA was Tricycle, was fed feet first into the furnace in the basement of the Lefortovo prison in front of his family. So he said, the judge just heard you say that you were sorry that there wasn't one more American agent that was killed. I said, what did I have to do with the KGB? I had nothing to do with them. He said, well, we know that now. But at the time, he said, did you notice how much security was in the courtroom? I said, yeah, there was more security than there were spectators. And he said, that's because there had been a large number of CIA field operatives who had volunteered to come back and kill me in the court. Because they thought that I had been responsible for Ames's crime. So there was one moment where I was in the middle of the night awakened and told that to go down to the R&D where you come in and leave, and because I was leaving for Andrews Air Force Base. Okay, I'm going home. All right. So when I got there, there were some individuals that were not dressed like prison guards. I recognized the dress. They were military, special forces type military. This isn't good. So they said, just put your suit on, which I did, and go out that door. And the door, I noticed, was to the officers' parking lot. So I understood what was going to happen. So I said, can I go to the bathroom? So they said, sure, go ahead. So I turned the corner and hid for 3 days until I got hungry. And what happened was there was a report that later came out that the FBI's hostage rescue unit was posted outside that door with orders to kill the first person that came out of that door who was an armed and dangerous escapee. So that was me. That was supposed to be me. So there were a lot of issues in my case that a lot of people are not aware of that really kind of explained the animus towards me particularly in the intelligence community. Later, when, as I explained to you earlier, Caspar Weinberger, shortly before his death, issued his memoirs. Edward Black, a noted Jewish historian in the United States, asked him why I wasn't mentioned in his memoirs. And he answered candidly, probably for the first time in his life, that my case had been made more important than it actually was. That it was really a minor matter, made more important for political reasons. So Ed asked him, wait a second, you submitted a signed affidavit to the court that there wasn't any spy who had committed more damage than I had to American security. And he just kind of laughed about it and said, well, things are said, for political effect in Washington. And that document cost me 30 years. So when this interview surfaced, my lawyers went to the Office of kind of Ethical Behavior. It's the ethics court, the ethics division of the Justice Department, and said, "Look, you've got to reopen this case. This is crazy. It's a false affidavit that was signed." And their attitude was, "It's water under the bridge."
Oh.
And I still had years to go before I got out. But there were so many different things that were occurring in my case that it was even hard for me to understand from time to time exactly why they hated me. Did they hate me because of Iran-Contra? Did they hate me because they thought I was a Soviet agent? Did they hate me because I was a Jew? Did they hate me because I was an Israeli agent? Did they hate me because I had a really bad sense of humor that I acted on at the wrong time and wrong place? I don't know. It was a very difficult moment in my life for 30 years. And the only thing that kept me going was Yirat Shamayim
and Esther.
And it was love that kept me going. The love of a good woman and love of land. And it was Kavod Harav Mordechai Eliyahu, Sefer Tzaddik Livracha, that pointed out that their initials were the same. Esther Yocheved, EY, and Eretz Yisrael, right. EY. So loving one allowed me to love the other. So in very large measure, she was the one that kept me alive for 30 years. So
it's another episode of the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports News Radio. Our guest this evening is Mr. Jonathan Pollard. A lot of people don't know this, but you were close to coming home a few times. Mm-hmm. Tell us a bit about that, because I don't think the public knows that it could have been possible you were going to be in prison only for 6 years,
right? And
then something happened. Tell us about it.
Yeah. If you go back and remember the...
this fly really likes you. I don't know.
No, it's okay. It's probably a CIA agent. Yeah. At any rate, see, time and place. I'm sure that's going to be held against me also. At any rate, actually, when I had my first interview with 60 Minutes, there were some really nasty things said by the Navy intelligence people that were trying to intimidate me during this interview. So the interviewer asked me, who are these people? And I said, they're naval intelligence. These are the boys that brought us Pearl Harbor. Well, that just, it didn't do me any good. I laughed. I laugh at my own jokes, so nobody else did. At any rate, there are a lot of very difficult things to talk about.
Sure.
And this is one of them. The first prime minister. There were 2 prime ministers of Israel that actually tried to get me home. Most of the others tried to keep me in jail for various reasons, either because they were embarrassed about their own culpability in the operation, or because they were afraid that I was going to come home and talk, because they all swore that they didn't know anything about it. And as you know, I don't talk, so they and I still haven't, and I won't. So they have nothing to worry about. The first prime minister was, believe it or not, Yitzhak Rabin. The other one was Bibi Netanyahu. But with Rabin, during the Israeli-Jordanian peace agreement that was signed in Washington, he actually secured my release to come home, because his position was, we don't leave a soldier on the field. That was Yitzhak Rabin. And I was alerted to the fact that I should get ready to come home. Esther was alerted. And then he was shot and killed. Okay. So when Shimon Peres, as the next prime minister, asked Clinton Slick Willie, to act on his promise, Clinton said, well, that promise was made to your predecessor. For you, I need a couple hundred terrorists released, and we'll talk about it. And Peres understandably said, look, we have buses blowing up in our capital right now. To release any terrorists right now would be political suicide. And Clinton said, well, then you have a difficult decision to make. Well, he passed on it. There was another instance where an American spy was caught in Israel. Happened to be an Israeli intelligence officer. And the deal was he would be released and I would be released, kind of as a swap. And the Americans insisted that I not be released until their guy had passed through Israeli airspace. And when I found out about this, because the time for my release had expired, I asked, is this the plan? And they said, yes. I said, you guys are crazy. Haven't you watched these old Cold War spy movies where the agents cross simultaneously in the middle of a bridge? And sure enough, I was right, because the minute the American airplane passed out of Israeli airspace, the deal was off. Right. Didn't see that coming. So there was another opportunity to leave at the end of the Clinton administration with all the pardons that were issued. And Mark Rich obviously got the pardon, well, the release that I was supposed to get. I wasn't asking for a pardon, but a commutation. And when all the documents from the special investigation that Congress initiated came out, it was very clear that I was used as misdirection to cover up for Mark Rich coming out. So that was a little disappointing. And then there was the Wye River experience where Clinton promised to release me to Bibi. And there was a meeting of cabinet officials, American cabinet officials, and I read the transcript, where every single one of them, starting from the president down to the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General at the time, they all said that I had been improperly sentenced and should be released on the merits. But I had value as not so much as a hostage, but as a means of exacting concessions from Israel, whether it was on Jerusalem or the Golan Heights or settlement activities, whatever, but that I had value. And it's kind of shocking to read that they were so open about the fact that they knew my sentence was improper, unethical, because Ames had already been caught. He confessed to using me. And this is why when the Senate Intelligence Committee wrote to Clinton saying, we got the guy, Pollard should be released. No, because I had value at that time. So this is how it worked. There was what's called the fourth Pi'imah here. This is where they were releasing terrorists under American pressure, as a goodwill gesture to the PA. And Kerry suggested that I would be released if Israel released some of the worst terrorists you could imagine, 2 of whom were just released. But in exchange, but the qualification was that I would never be able to go home to Israel, not even my body after I died. I would be in the Midbar forever. So Esther was asked with the unpalatable duty of coming to ask me for my response. And at the time I thought, it's kind of unethical to ask somebody like me, who had no hope at the time of release, to make this kind of deal, or to authorize this kind of deal. But actually the government knew that they were on pretty firm ground, safe ground, by asking me. So when Esther came to see me for one day, because she had to fly back to Israel to report to the cabinet what my decision was, she said to me, she prefaced her remarks by saying, if you decide to stay here, whether in prison for the rest of your life or in exile, I will stay with you in the Midbar, no matter what. And that's why if you look at her kever, that quote from Tehillim about stay in the Midbar, I knew you when you were young in the Midbar, I put that on her kever. So she said, just keep that in mind when you make this decision. So she said, are you willing to go ahead with this decision? And I said, no. So she said, would you give me a slightly longer answer that I could give them? And I said, hell no. And so she said, that's not, you're an educated person. You've been through war colleges, graduate school, whatever. You've been an officer, Can you give me a reasonable answer? So I said, yes, I'm declining this offer, this poisoned chalice, as I put it, for 3 reasons. 1, it devalues the life of our victims. 2, it lowers deterrence. And 3, it would inflict horrific pain and suffering on the victims' families. And I can't do that. So she said, is that your answer? And I said, yeah, that's my answer. And she said, well, that's a very fine answer, but it's not the Jewish answer. So I said, okay, what's the Jewish answer? And she said, we live for Shemaim. Everything we do in our life is in preparation for that moment where we stand before the Kisei HaKavod to probably, she said, defend our actions. And she said, if you forsake the land for the Midbar, she said, you will be making the same mistake that the sin that the Meraglim made in the desert when they slandered the land in order to maintain their koved in the Midbar. And she said, we've been paying for that ever since. She said, as Jews, we live for Shemaim, and we have 3 principles we have to defend at all costs. Am Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, Al Pi Torat Yisrael. She said, your choice really boils down to one of the following. You either go home as a met, as a body, to be buried in Kever Yisrael, or you go home as an old man and kiss the ground. And that was the origin, by the way, of my decision to do that when I landed in Ben Gurion. So she said, those are the only options you have. So I said, so that's the Jewish answer? And she said, yes. I said, then you can put my name on it. And she did. But as I said, she was my morah. And that's a classic example of where her teaching I was able to put into practice. So there were moments where it looked like I was going to be released. But in each and every one of them, they amounted to a test. Sometimes for me, other times for other people. But they were all tests. Yitzhak Rabin passed. Bibi passed. Esther passed. And that's about it.
And you mentioned Mark Rich because it's my understanding that after he received a pardon from Bill Clinton, that there was a story in the New York Times that kind of suggested that you should have done something like Mark Rich did.
Oh, yeah. My prosecutor, Joe DeGeneva, absolutely wretched man. As I said in 60 Minutes, he was somebody who was a legend in his own mind. Not a good thing to talk about as a U.S. attorney, but it was true. Suggested in the New York Times, he was working for Mark Rich at the time. He had kind of been forced out of the Justice Department for incompetence. And he said, my mistake was I was too proud to pay the $250,000 required by the Clinton Library to secure my release. This was on the front page of the New York Times. And nobody batted an eyelash. And it was true. I was asked to pay $250,000 by the Clinton administration to secure my release. And there were witnesses to this. This is not hearsay. This is not me making this up. There were witnesses there in the prison when the deal was made. And there were two people that were willing to cut the checks right then and there for me. Let's get this done. And I said, no. And Esther just kind of looked at me quizzically, like, what are you thinking? And I said, my release from prison has to be as kosher as my arrest. And she said, your arrest wasn't kosher. And I said, yeah, it actually was. It was a test for me and the American Jewish community and for the government of Israel. I said, I hope I pass eventually. But the American Jewish establishment in the state of Israel, the leadership, is currently failing. And I said, I don't expect anything to change in that. But I said, this is a test for me right now. And she said, it could be, we want to have children. This could be the only time we have, because her cancer was really advancing at the time. And it may have been the last chance we had to have children. And I said, do you really want me to come home this way with a bribe? And she thought about it and she said no.
Wow.
And that was why we turned it down. There was no way, just like there was no way for me to agree to this swap with the terrorists, there was no way for her to accept my release with a bribe. And that was to her merit. So, yeah, there were many opportunities to leave, but ultimately they turned out to be tests of either myself or Esther or others in the case.
You mentioned earlier that generally you and Esther would agree on strategy and what to do, but my understanding there was a story where Esther met with a certain somebody in Tel Aviv without your knowledge, and she recorded. It was like James Bond type of stuff. Very risky.
Yeah, I was horrified when I found out about it. Rafi Eitan asked him to meet with her. And I didn't know about this at the time. She didn't ask my permission, or she didn't discuss it with me. And he met her in an abandoned warehouse in South Tel Aviv. He was sitting at a table with one kind of lamp burning over him with two tough guys. We call them no-necks in the profession, standing behind him. And she came in alone. And she did have two things with her. One of them was a tape recorder. And he asked her, they talked. And he said the only mistake he made was not putting a bullet in my head at the embassy. It would have saved him a lot of trouble. And at that moment, Esther, alayha shalom, leaned forward, made sure her purse opened, and she had a 9mm semi-automatic in her purse. And she said, well, I guess we're even, because the only mistake I'm making is not putting one in your head. And she backed out. Tough girl. And she went straight to the radio stations with the tape recording of what he said. And everybody was shocked. And he admitted, what could he do? I mean, it's his voice. And he was proud about it. And again, it was kind of like nothing happened. Nobody said anything. There was another incident where I found out how I was caught. There was a CIA agent in the Knesset Foreign Affairs Committee, Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, a Ariel Sharon appointee, ex-FSU Ola. And how did I find out about this? He sued the CIA for inadequate retirement in open court. And as one of his exploits, he said he had found me and had reported me to his masters. And it was confirmed. So the judge ruled in New York that everything that he had alleged was true, but that an open court wasn't the right venue for deliberating this issue. Well, he didn't get what he wanted, so he came back to Israel and went on radio and revealed what he'd done to me. So one of the interviewers said, "Wait a second, you betrayed Jonathan? What are you doing back here?" Well, he didn't answer that, but the answer was kind of obvious. He wanted to be arrested because that would be kind of a cause célèbre at that. He would be a cause célèbre and he might get some money out of it from the CIA. So Esther went to the then head of the Shabak, who later became an MK, and said, you just have the confession of a traitor. Arrest him and trade him. And the answer was, we don't want to upset the Americans. We don't want to upset the Americans. Okay. Again, they failed the test. Hashem gave them an opportunity to get me home, and they failed. So yeah, there were many instances where I could have come home, but for one reason or another, it didn't work out.
Now, a lot of people don't know this, but even after you were released from prison under house arrest, even that when that was done, there was a chance you were not going to make it to Israel, correct?
Yeah. What happened was we found out that the incoming Biden administration had already made a decision that they were going to re-indict me because I hadn't talked, I hadn't cooperated, I hadn't done what they wanted me to do. So the indictment would have carried a natural life sentence. So it was very important for me to get out of the country as quickly as I could after my parole was after my parole ended. And that was because of Ron Dermer and
another Jew, right?
A good Jew.
Yeah, right.
A good Jew. And Sheldon and Miriam Adelson, two good Jews. And the chief of staff at the time of Trump, a good Christian. And yeah, I can say that. He is a good Christian, although he's facing imprisonment now. They were the ones. Trump didn't know anything at all, didn't care. So what to do? So we found out that I needed an American passport to leave the United States because I was a dual national. And the American law states that if you're a dual national, you have to come and leave on an American passport. Well, how am I supposed to get an American passport? The State Department said, well, maybe 8 months, 9 months, and in your case, who knows how long it'll take. And it was clear that I was over the limit. I was going to get arrested again. So the day, Christmas Eve, I get a call from Ron Dermer saying, you need to get across Manhattan to the passport office in Hudson Yard, and you'll get a new passport. And I said, I looked out the window and it was bumper-to-bumper traffic. I said, I'm on the east side by the UN, and you want me to get across Manhattan to the Hudson? I said, it's impossible. I sent him a picture of the traffic. He said, you've got to get, this is your last chance. So, okay, so Esther and I walked down to the street and we flagged a cab. It was the window rolled down and there's just a stream of marijuana smoke came out. And there was a Jamaican driver, Rastafarian hat and dreads, everything. I said, well, this could be interesting. So we got into the car and I showed him $100 bill and I said, you get this if you can get me to the passport office in Hudson Yards within the next 20 minutes. And driving up one-way streets and driving on the sidewalk, and he did it. So I guess I gave him enough money to have a good evening that night. And I walked in, and I had never been called sir so many times. Nobody knew who I was. They had gotten what's called a rocket from Pompeo as Secretary of State with the orders to give me a passport as quickly as possible, no matter what I said. I didn't have a lot of the information, like what hospital my father was born in. Well, he was born on a farm. So I just made up a hospital in Hartford, Connecticut. It didn't matter. So about a half hour later, I walked out on the streets with Esther, alayhi shalom, and I'm looking at a brand new passport. And I said, how did this happen? And she said, well, Joseph was rushed out of the bore. So she said, now you have to go get a haircut. And I said, I'm not Joseph. I'm not getting a haircut. So we got on the airplane the next day. This is the private airplane of Miriam and Sheldon Adelson. And there wasn't anybody around. There weren't any customs around. There was nobody. And the engines were still running when we got on the plane. And we took off, and everybody was clapping, and everybody was very happy, and I just quieted everybody down, and I just said, we're not out of American airspace yet. And the whole time I was expecting 2 fighters to come up and just turn us around. But the minute we crossed into Canadian airspace, I said, okay, we're home. So when we were approaching Israel, the coast of Israel, at about 3 o'clock in the morning, the entire coastline just lit up. This was Tel Aviv, metropolitan Tel Aviv. And Miriam had instructed the pilot to have Esther and myself sit in the jump seats behind the pilot and co-pilot. And so we got a bird's eye view, more or less, of coming home. So we were saying Tehillim all the way. So when we landed, I looked out the window and there were just TV cameras everywhere. And I said, oh my God, because Bibi had promised Trump that there wouldn't be any publicity if I were ever released. Oh, promises, okay. Words on paper, it's whatever. So when we finally parked, I looked out the window again and was horrified. There was Bibi, right where the stairs were leading down. And I turned to Esther and I said, my God, Bibi is there. I said, I don't have anything prepared. What am I supposed to say? And she smiled at me and leaned back and she said, I'm retired. This is your show now. So when we left the airplane, there was an expression that I had always wanted to use coming home, but I never knew how I would use it. And I had the opportunity. God gave me the opportunity. When we were passing the cockpit, the captain, who was an older guy, looked at me and said, who are you? And the phrase came up. I said, I'm just an old Jew returning to his homeland. And he looked at me and shook his head and he said, you're not Meyer Lansky. Who was one of my heroes, by the way.
Speaking of Godfather 2.
Yeah, speaking of Godfather 2. Right. One of my heroes. Never went to prison, never ratted, never did anything. Good man, and helped Israel.
He did.
In 1948, he helped Israel, and they screwed him when he came home. They sent him back to the United States. It was disgraceful what they did. But such is the nature of Medinat Yisrael. So we came home, And we came home to go into Bidud, prison, again. And, you know, the fact that our apartment has bars on the window, we're on a garden apartment, just made me feel real comfortable. You know, I just said, wow, I'm home again, you know, back in prison. Can't go out, can't do this, can't do that. But when I finally got out, 14 days later, Esther alayhi shalom said, where do you want to go? I said, I want to go to Jaffa Street. And I think we were the only people there except for cats. It was frightening. It was like something out of a dystopian novel. Yeah. You know, there was just nobody around. And I just said to myself, this is not the way I wanted to come home. But you play the cards that you're dealt. So, and then Esther got really sick after that, really sick. And so we spent more time in the hospital than we did out on the street. And she's a brave girl. She fought hard to stay alive. But it was too late. And she did not die of COVID. I want to just clarify something.
I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah, she did not die of COVID. The cause of death was bacterial infection. She had zero immunity. She had 2 types of metastatic breast cancer. She had leukemia. The leukemia, there were no normal blood cells at all. It was all leukemic. And she had what's called MDS, which is a disease of the bone marrow. She basically didn't have any bone marrow. So it was a hard death at the end, but she did it with grace. I never saw her complain. I never heard her complain. She didn't eat for 5 weeks. She wanted to die at home. But she did not die of COVID. And that's on the official record. She did not die of COVID. She did say 2 things just before she died. The first had to do with politics, and she told me to take my mask off. I was in the COVID ICU. I was the only one up to that point that had been allowed in due to the humanity of a new head nurse. So I was in an Army CBW outfit, not a paper outfit. It was a plastic outfit with a mask, gas mask, everything. She said to me, take your mask off. And I didn't care at that point, one way or the other. I knew what was going to happen. So I took my mask off. And she said to me, when I die, they're coming for you. And by that, she meant the politicians. She was the gatekeeper that let me do my business, free of interference from the politicians. So she said, let me ask you a question. What is politics? This woman is about to die within minutes, and she's asking me a question. What is politics? So I said, sweetheart, you're not going to live long enough for me to give you the full academic answer. So she laughed mirthlessly. She said, well, I'll give you the short answer. Politics is the art of compromise. What are you willing to compromise? Maharat HaMachpelah, Hebron, Har Habayit, the Kotel, Har Ival, Kever Yosef, Kashrut, Shabbat, Gerush. What are you willing to compromise? Answer me. And I thought about it for a second and I said, nothing. I'm not willing to compromise anything. And she said, that's why you don't become a member of a party. You stay independent and you make your own mind up as to what you say and what you endorse and what you support. And then she said the second thing was marry her.
Rivka, you know, there's a concept in Pirkei Avot that 3 things are acquired through suffering. Talmud Torah, Olam Haba, Eretz Yisrael. But did you ever think maybe...
Oh, you've never had a meal cooked by me then, because that's
number 4.
That could be number 4.
But did you ever have a conversation with God and say, can't you give me a pass on the Eretz Yisrael part? the prison thing, like, I have to suffer again. Did you ever have that conversation with her?
Suffering. I don't know who she was, and I don't know what she was. But as people know the story, she woke up after she was dead. And she said, my neshama volunteered to come back to do 2 missions. One, to bring you home, and the second, to bring you home as a real Jew and not a goy. And she said the first mission was the easiest of all, to bring you home. And that came as a shock to me, but that was typical of Esther. And she said the second mission was to bring you home as a real Jew. Took me 30 years. But Baruch Hashem, I succeeded in both my missions, and now I can go home.
Wow.
So doctors consider what happened or what they witnessed to be a, quote, medical anomaly, which is, if you'll excuse my French bullshit, it was a miracle. It was pure evidence of a neshama. And that's why when I said Baruch Dayan Hemet, I meant it. I don't want to die, obviously. I'm not looking forward to it, but I'm not afraid of it anymore. Because I understand there's something beyond science. The only one that really understood what happened was, Dafka, the Arab doctor that was there. He understood exactly what had happened, what he had witnessed. So, a tragedy, when you're living God's will, when you're on a mission, is it a tragedy? No. We should all be so lucky, because at that moment, her death was it was a liberation of her neshama. You could go home. So tragedy, no. For me, I was. I wouldn't want anybody to be in the situation I was in at that point. But she did, in her will, and we discussed it before she died, asked me for one thing, that a Sefer Torah should be written. Yeah. So I did. So we had the Hachnasat Sefer Torah on Monday.
On our yahrzeit.
Mm-hmm. So it was a celebration of life, because the Sefer Torah has a neshama as well. So every time that Sefer Torah is read, it'll be an Elui Nishmata for her every week. So that was her. She didn't ask for anything else except the Sefer Torah.
Wow.
So we did it. I completed my mission.
I've studied different stories of people that imprisoned for a long time. Not as long as you, but Admiral Stockdale's ran as vice president
in Vietnam, North Vietnam.
Right, he was the head of Hitler for 7 years.
Yeah, that was real hell. Yeah.
But it sounds like you went through some hell as well. But he said in the book called Good to Great,
mm-hmm.
he was happy for the experience. It made him a better person.
Right.
How do you feel about that? Do you feel like it made you a better person to go through that experience?
Yeah.
Closer to God and overall a better Jew?
Closer to God, a better Jew, someone who could look at a wife and say, I love you, and mean it. They aren't just words for me. A lot of guys don't realize that their lives may depend on their wives. And so,
I think there's some people in the room that do.
Well, I usually, given my experience, I usually give prospective husbands the following advice, based on my own experiences, that if you want to be a good husband, and I always say this in front of the fiancé, always kiss your wife good morning and good night, because you never know how the day will end. I kissed my wife in the morning and buried her at night. So you never know. Second of all, never go to bed angry. That's a bad thing. And thirdly, remember, the most important aspect of a marriage is your wife is always right. Well, the wives like to hear that. The fiancés like to hear. The guys, I usually get some dirty looks from that. But I think it's pretty wise advice to prospective husbands. Am I a better person now? You'll have to ask my wife. Do I feel like I'm a better person? Yeah, I do. I'm more responsible than I was before. I understand that there is a God in heaven, and you better be careful how you act in this life, because you'll be held accountable for it when you go upstairs. And I'm not tempted anymore to kind of cross the line, which at the time when I was active in Washington, it was a pretty wild time in the mid-'80s in Washington. And now, despite what we're all going through here, I don't have a problem. I mean, I'm able to determine now kind of right from wrong because of that experience. I saw people die horrible deaths. I saw people do unimaginably noble things in prison that you would never expect. I saw a wife walk through drifts of snow for 10 kilometers to see me on a wintry day where visiting was closed. She was wet from the waist down. And she was prepared to walk back 10 kilometers at night until an officer said, "Come with me, I have a 4-wheel drive and I'm delivering the officers back to their homes. I can't let you walk 10 kilometers back to a hotel in this weather," which proved to me that even in Gehenna, there's decency. That's one of the biggest lessons I learned. It's up to the individual, no matter where you are, to act decently. I saw it in Hadassah. Arab doctors and nurses and technicians treat Esther with incredible kindness and professionalism. And that was something that I wasn't expecting. I just wish more of their brothers and sisters would act that way. I was able to say no to offers that looked pretty good, any number of things, and felt good about it. So did it make me a better person? I'll know when I stand before the Kisei HaKavod, and he asked me, why I did certain things, and I'll say, well, I forgot.
I don't recall.
I don't recall.
Right.
I don't recall what you're saying. So yeah, and look, I saw actually a lot of people come out of prison better than they were when they went in. I did. I have to admit that. But I also saw the obverse, which was I saw a lot of good people come out really badly, horribly, because of their decisions in prison. And I saw people shot off the fence. We had a kill line. And when people were tired and they couldn't do it anymore, they just crossed the line and just waited. And it's really amazing to see somebody just shot to pieces for no reason, except for the fact that the 2 officers got $200 and 2 weeks paid leave for doing that. I begged them not to shoot this guy. And his wife had divorced him, and he finished. And they just told me to lie down, which I did, and there was nothing left of him. Nothing left of him. So they just left the pieces on the fence. And there was another instance where a man was about to go home. He had cancer, but he was about to go home. And there was one guy in our unit that was dying of pancreatic cancer, which is particularly painful. He had broken out of every federal prison that they'd put him in without harming anybody. He was an embarrassment. So they decided that he wouldn't get any pain medication, nothing. And one night he was begging anybody to kill him. He didn't have enough strength to kill himself, but he was just begging everybody, please, just put me out of my misery. So I sat on the bed with him. I was holding his hand, and I was trying to explain to him that there is virtue in pain. You have to just accept it and live. And all of a sudden, one of the guys that was about to go home, he also had cancer. He'd done 36, 37 years. Day for day, he never talked. He never ratted on anybody, nothing. He was finally going to go home. He had a Vicodin patch on his arm for the pain. And if you took that patch off, it left a blue mark around the area. And that was 5 years, day for day, because you're going to use it for drug pushing. And we were screaming, what are you doing? What are you doing? You're going home in just a couple of weeks. And he slapped it on the guy's arm. And within a few minutes, he was asleep. He was okay. And all he kept saying was, I couldn't deal with him in this kind of pain. I couldn't deal with it. So they came and arrested him that night. And the next day I saw something remarkable. There were almost 1,000 men, Mexicans, Vietnamese, blacks, whites, everybody. And if you know anything about prison, that doesn't happen. Lined up to beg the internal security people not to charge him. You don't see that at all, ever. So finally, when I kind of indexed up, the internal security people looked at me and said, what are you doing in here? You don't talk. And I said, you've got to give this guy a break. And the head of security, internal security, said, I have. He said, that's his charge sheet through the shredder. It never happened. So when this guy left 2 weeks later, everybody, it seemed, showed up to say goodbye to him. And a couple of weeks later, he died. But this is called atoning for a life of crime and a life of mayhem and murder and indifference to the welfare of others. And in that last moment, for whatever reason, I think he atoned for what he had done. I hoped he did. So you saw all kinds of crazy things in prison over 30 years that you just, with myself, without going into any details, I have 100% disability. There were some, I didn't talk, and they needed information. So I have 100% disability. My back is broken in 4 places. So when Rav Avram Shapira talked to me just before I went to speak at his yeshiva 2 years ago, he had seen the Bagatz petition that we had submitted before it was classified, where we found out that the government knew, the Mossad in particular, knew exactly what they were doing to me. I have a plate in my head also. And they did nothing to help me. So he asked me, he said, I read the Bagatz. He said, what were you davening for that whole time? And I kind of laughed, and I said, the only thing I was davening for was that Hashem should keep my mouth shut. And, he did. So that was kind of my first awakening as to who runs the world. Because under ordinary circumstances, I should have talked, but I didn't. So you live and die by your actions. And people ask me, do you have any regrets? And I'd like to say I do. but I can't think of any right now. I don't recall any. Maybe I wish I could have been more effective as an agent. Maybe I should have married Esther long before I did. But God runs the world, so I accept all my actions and hope I learn from them, the right things. So.
It's another episode of the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports and News Radio. 50 more minutes with Mr. Jonathan Pollard. I want to ask kind of a lighter question because you've been in Israel this time around about 3.5 years. Mm-hmm. I want to know what being an Israeli means to you, because I know these Americans that come, they put on a angry face. They think being Israeli means to pretend to be tough and eat falafel and then go to Thailand and all this weird stuff. That's not what it means to me. I've been in Israel almost 14 years in a row. I like to fight for justice verbally or sometimes not verbally. I want to know what it means to you to be an Israeli.
Esther, when we first got here, when she was still mobile, took me to Geula and Mea Sharim, two places I'd never been before. And she said to me, look at these people. They don't talk like you, they don't act like you, they don't dress like you, they don't daven like you. They don't think like you, but they are your brothers and sisters. And they kept our faith alive for 2,000 years in Galut, so you owe them respect. You may not agree with them, but you will disagree with them respectfully and with love. And then she took me to places in Tel Aviv that I didn't think a frum girl knew about. Let's put it that way. And she said, I want you to look at these people here. They don't act like you. I said to myself, Baruch Hashem, they don't act like you, they don't talk like you, they don't dress like you, they don't think like you, but they are your brothers and sisters. And they may be off the derech, but just as Rav Kook said, you bring people back with love. You don't yell and scream at them. You bring them back with love. And you treat them with respect. And I didn't really put that into practice until one night. I was walking to Yemen Moshe to a friend's house for a Malav Malka, and it was still Shabbat. And a car pulled up next to me near the Inbal, full of young people, and the music was really loud. And they stopped, and they said very nice things to me, welcome home, and we're happy to see you, and everything else. And I thought about how I would react, how Esther would have reacted. And I thanked them and I said, Shabbat Shalom. And the music stopped. And, I got my point across without being insulting. And they drove off. I've been to, being Israeli means you show up to levayas of victims of terrorist attack. And you try to console the families. I remember Yehuda Guetta, Alev Shalom, when he died at the Tapuach Junction. I know his family. So I was asked to say one of the hespids for him. And I looked across at this seething mass of men, many of whom were armed. And I realized this was kind of a lake of gasoline, and I could just throw a match into it and I wouldn't know what would have happened. Vengeance, Nikuma, I don't know. But Esther came up to me because she knew I was getting ready to give a campaign speech at that point. And she said to me, look at the family. Look at the family. Which I did. And she said, those are the people you talk to, not those people. Look at the family. And she calmed me down. And that's part of being an Israeli also, I believe, to feel compassion and responsibility for the survivors of a pegua, because they'll never be the same, ever. Being Israeli means getting really mad with people and going like this, which I didn't know what that meant, but I do now. being Israeli means being disappointed also at the inappropriate behavior of others. As we were going to Esther's Azkara at Har HaMenuchot on Monday, we were trapped. Couldn't, and Shkia is coming, and we had to start davening Tehillim in the van before getting to the kever. And I got really angry at these people that were protesting and not even permitting ambulances to go through. And I was getting angry at the police for doing nothing, to facilitating the shutting down of a whole city, our capital. And being Israeli means getting angry for the right reason. And for me at that point, there was an expression that I had heard, I'd read actually on a counter-protest banner. It said, "We had a democratic election, you lost, get over it." And that's the kind of, I was proud when I saw that, because it really addressed the real issues. It wasn't ad hominem, it wasn't threatening. Being Israeli also understands that we are not a perfect democracy, with everything that means, and accepting it, because this is what we have now. Esther had a great expression, which I use with a lot of people, when they say, well, we're not voting, we're waiting for Moshiach. And her response, which I use now, is that, well, maybe Moshiach is waiting for us. Right? Wise words. So being Israeli means I have to push this in somebody's face. So okay, I do it kind of at a distance and politely. Being Israeli means that on Independence Day, you suddenly realize that we are the beneficiaries of 2,000 years of blood, sweat, and tears by our predecessors, and that our actions should bring honor to them and not cause their neshamas to suffer on account of our bad behavior. I think the most important thing about being Israeli is recognizing that we're home. Finally, we're home. With everything that means. Good, bad, and indifferent. And this is what I hope I can translate effectively to my relatives and my co-religionists back in Chutz La'aretz. Come home. Your soul will feel much better for it. And as an Israeli, conservative, right-wing, nationalist, religious, I couldn't be prouder of being home. Now I'm part of the future. I know a lot of people in Chutz La'aretz don't like to hear that. They consider where they are the future. Well, they aren't. Their part of our history is ending. This is where it's beginning again, and hopefully, God willing, we will see Moshiach by our action, on account of our actions, good actions. So,
I know we talk about promoting your school. I have one last question. I know Wikipedia doesn't always get everything right about you.
Really?
Sometimes they get things wrong. Sometimes.
Yeah.
But according to Wikipedia, your birthday is August 7th, 1954, on a Saturday. I don't know if you were born before sundown or after. If you were born before sundown, you were a Shabbat baby. If you're born after sundown, you were born on the 9th of Av. Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, if you see me riding around on a
white donkey,
on a Chamor Lavan, then you know good things are happening. I have one parked in my garage. Yes, I scare people by confirming the fact that I was born on Tisha B'Av. The Rav always thought that was funny. He got a laugh out of it. I don't know why, whether he was crying or whether he was actually laughing over that. But yes, I was born on Tisha B'Av.
All right.
So
All right.
Another tragedy. Another Jewish tragedy.
I guess we'll see what happens down the road if the prophecies come true regarding a white donkey and people born on the 9th of Av. You start a wonderful school in Esther's memory. Tell us about it, because people should get involved in any way they can, because it's a great way to honor her.
Yeah. I was thinking after she died, how could I memorialize her life? And putting up a statue, we don't do. Putting up a plaque, well, it weathers with age. So she had been a teacher for many years, so I thought a living memorial would be better. So after talking about it with several people, we decided to put together a gan. We call it a children's learning center in Tel Aviv. And at the dedication of the temporary facilities, we have about 500 kids now there, young kids. I asked some of the parents with tattoos and metal in their faces and whatever, why did you send your children here? And the answers were all pretty similar. And I want you to pay attention, if you can, to what answer I got. Most of the people there, the parents, said, our parents denied us an understanding of our faith and why we're here. We want our children to teach us. So I looked at Kavod Harav Micha Halevi, who's the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Petach Tikva, who was astounded. And I said, Ze Giulah, because it's our tradition that as part of the Giulah Shlema, children will teach the parents. So I implore people, you fought so long for me. Let's fight for a whole generation now. Because for Esther, the next war, we're currently in it, will involve the Jewish identity of the state. And so we're hoping that by teaching these kids at the earliest age who and what we are, they will have the intellectual material at their disposal to make a decision later on, whether they want to remain observant or not. The decision is theirs. Our responsibility is to give them the material necessary for them to make an educated decision. If you want to walk away, well, at least you have the understanding of how to come back if you choose to do that. And if not, we did our best. So the school is basically designed to ensure that the next generation of kids growing up understand exactly who and what they are. And when a young kid brings candles home for his mother for Shabbat, she'll light them. She may not know why. She may feel odd doing it, but she's doing it. And that's the first step on the road to redemption. So when I went there for the first time, I've been around these schools, and a gan is a balagan when you walk in. I was scared the first time I went in. I was bum rushed by thousands of kids. It was horrible. So there are these kids, it's quiet, it's disciplined, it's very nice, and they're all saying brachot before eating. And I said, okay, this is good. This is a good start, because when they go home, they'll do the same thing. And maybe their parents will emulate them. So I know that these are a lot of reasons I just laid out for doing this project, but it won't be the only one we do. I'm not good at being a shill for anything. But on this one, like the Sefer Torah, I owed it to my wife to complete one of her missions, which was participating in the war for our Jewish identity. So I hope with B'ezrat Hashem, we'll make it in terms of the amount of money we need. So.
Well, I got to tell you, I've done thousands of interviews. This is the highlight of my professional career. Thank you. One of the greatest nights of my life. And also, other people want to thank as well. First, I want to thank my mom. My mom's right there. When I was 16 years old, there was a public access station in Phoenix called Access Phoenix. So my mom encouraged me to get involved with that. She's always encouraged my broadcasting career. So I want to say thanks, Mom. Actually, I'd like people to clap for my mom.
Why not?
I also want to thank Beth Zuckerman of Breathe Quality Studios. She's helped me incorporate some back issues I have. The ELC, Svi Lipschitz, Ben Brusky. Shout out to Radio Mike, Hugh Garden Hills, Farley Weiss, everyone for coming. And one more time, for people that want to get involved with the school, where can they go and do that?
You can go to charity. We have a site for contributing.
What's the website?
It's a charity website.
Okay.
And there's a special site for the school.
Okay.
And it's a good site to use.
Okay. And they go to charity, and what would they type for the name for the school?
It's already laid out.
It's laid out. Okay.
It's laid out.
Pretty simple. They can do that.
Yeah.
So get involved. Get involved in some form. Big amount, small amount. Be part of the future. Be part of the solution. You don't just complain about problems. That's a Woody Allen Jewish thing. We're back home. We're trying to solve problems. So thank you everyone for coming. This has been another episode of the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports and News Radio. And that's it for tonight. God bless and good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's